Thank you, Bates. Just before stepping in, actually, I did a little sort of unscientific review of the BBC News website and picked out 3 articles just at random from their page. The first one showed that BP statistics said that 2010 was the year with the highest ever global consumption of energy. That China is driving the demand. China's demand was 10% higher last year than it was the year before, which is already a record. Of course, we're familiar with the fact that many of the benchmark global energy prices, not least the Brent crude in the oil markets, are at record highs. Brent crude is at about close to $118 a barrel. And that energy demand and prices are rising at the fastest time since 1973, which was, of course, when we had the last major energy shock, or 2 shocks, in fact. Second story was that there's been almost unprecedented social unrest in China, with migrants rioting and having to be suppressed. The trigger for this rioting was price rises driven by resource price rises. And thirdly, Vietnam was conducting live fire exercise at sea in the context of a sort of a serious set of tensions with China around control of disputed maritime territory, but in fact it was a question of really what's under the sea, namely the energy resources and possibly the fish there. So I think it's fairly safe to say that resources are a top issue now on the international agenda, perhaps unprecedented level of interest in this area. And in the SIPRI Yearbook this year, what we aim to do is try to examine what is driving this question of resources, and particularly to look at the security and conflict implications of this, as I said, unprecedented situation regarding natural resources and competition around those questions. In part, our interest, I think, was triggered by the Arab Spring, which, of course, was not directly about resources, but nonetheless highlights the way that resources can be closely tied to conflict. You may remember that the dispute that became violent and then led to the overthrow of the regime in Tunisia was sparked by someone committing or burning themselves alive because of high food prices and the pressures that was putting on his family and was reflected more widely in society. So clearly these pressures have been coming through and been connected to violence for some time. And I think really what we wanted to highlight was that there are 3 distinct dimensions of this resource question that when we look around the world today, that seem to be intersecting and causing this particular relationship, a tightening of these 3 dimensions between each other. The first one that we focus on in the yearbook is the issue of how conflict itself is tied to economic interests, economic questions. This is not necessarily a new observation. It's, I think, an agenda that appeared in the 1990s with the end of the Cold War, when many people had understood conflict to be essentially about different ideologies and political interests. As we moved away from that confrontation and people began to focus more on what was happening in the localities, particularly in Africa and Asia, around armed conflict, it became apparent that, in fact, economic factors were just as important as political grievances. That if you looked at how conflicts operated, why they started, then economic factors were a fundamental issue here, and often natural resources were the key. And just even to give you 3 examples recently, I think the violence we've seen in Sudan between the north and the south shows how competition over oil resources can be closely related to the onset of violence. It's not the only factor, but nonetheless it certainly is a central one in understanding what's happening in Sudan today. Secondly, that resource questions can explain in part why conflicts become protracted, why they go on for many years. And that is often because resources become the main purpose of the conflict. People are fighting to control resources. And I won't go into too much detail there because, in fact, my colleague Ruben de Kooning will talk about Democratic Republic of Congo, where I think illustrates very clearly that question about how resources are at the heart of ongoing violence. And thirdly, that resource questions and the way they're managed can be important to understanding how the conditions for violence can emerge. And this is really a question of state weakness, that the countries that rely or over-reliant on resource incomes can develop state that are weak, disconnected from their society, and prone to breakdown. And I guess if we look around the world today, Libya would be a very clear example of this, in which a relatively rich country, in terms of the resources, actually had a state that didn't command wide legitimacy across its territory. And of course now we have a civil war raging in effect. And these issues, of course, are also linked to increasing concern about international crime and the black market. Resources are often key elements in those narcotics trades, people trafficking, as well as the classic minerals and other kinds of resources. So that, I think, is the first area that we wanted to highlight. The second dimension, which is increasingly intersecting with this, is the way in which environmental concerns are increasing the pressure on resources. There's been a lot of research, really beginning, I suppose, from the 1960s, concern about environmental aspects of conflict, that high population growth, limits to growth, famine and finite resources can be something of a worry on the international agenda. The question of climate change, though, I think has given a far sharper focus to how these issues of environmental security can be linked to questions of conflict. And this is really to do with a set of factors. Firstly, that climate issues can create vulnerabilities. Food security, I think, is a very clear issue today. There are projections now that food prices could double up to 2020 in some places, and will likely hit the most vulnerable communities, communities that are already perhaps vulnerable to conflict. That environmental issues can be reversing the process of development. They can increase the risk of conflict over resources, and they can negatively affect international cooperation over shared or undemarcated natural resources. And at the heart of this is really, I think, a question about scarcity. Unlike the 1970s, where there was a sense there was an absolute amount of resources available and you would use them until you hit a barrier, today the focus is on scarcity and how scarcity can create these kind of pressures. This is resource scarcities engendered by climate change create competition, instability, social dislocation and tensions. But of course, that's not to say that it's a simply mechanistic relationship. Societies can adapt, and they do adapt. So there's no automatic link between these issues and conflict. It points to the political aspect of how we manage these issues to do with climate change and adaptation. And in that context, the last issue has become particularly important. I think explains particularly this aspect of increasing interest in resources. And that is a new geopolitics, a new global political economy around resources and use and access to resources, driven in part by the rise of the new large consumer and manufacturing countries of Asia, China and India, but also Indonesia increasingly, on top of existing OECD demand around the world. We've now got a rising, unprecedented level of competition for global resources, which has an international relations dimension. Some authors have gone so far as to say that we face resource wars in the future. In the yearbook, I think we don't exactly see resource wars today or the immediate prospect, but we do see resources increasingly being involved in tensions, weakening of relations between states, and causing competition that can then be linked to conflict. A good example of this complex interlinking of these different issues, for example, today might be just in the last week we've seen discussion about the purchase of agricultural land in Africa by countries seeking to secure their food security by buying land in Africa to grow produce that then is directly exported to their own markets. Behind that question, of course, is really an issue of water, because when you buy land, what you're really doing is buying the water that goes into the agriculture. That water dispute is now also feeding into a question about the Nile and upstream and downstream aspects of the Nile usage and the relations between the states there. So I think all of these things show that there's a very complicated set of relations that needs to be understood. So those are some of the challenges that we identify. What we wanted to do in conclusion is just to point to some ways that are already under debate or might be developed to try to manage these aspects and to try and counter the negative regional, international security and conflict dimensions of these, this resource issue. Firstly is the fact that there are some very successful models around. We've had the Kimberley process on the so-called conflict diamonds. There's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, both of which are really about having transparency in trade. These have been successful and they point to some ways forward. There are other sectoral examples. There's also been national-led efforts. We've seen in the United States legislation around trying to promote just and fair and transparent sourcing of minerals, which I think Ruben may talk about, particularly in the case of Congo. But the scale of these problems suggests that we may need to look to a larger community, an international community level discussion around some of these issues. Just yesterday I saw that President Sarkozy of France and Manuel Barroso of the European Commission issued a statement calling for legislation to regulate resource markets. I think this is linked to the French initiative in the G20. This is obviously an important and good start, but it's not the only thing that needs to be done. There are key principles that need to be balanced. The question of access to markets with the question of how to ensure that that access isn't destabilizing in a security and conflict way. There's a question about the role of markets in general versus national sovereignty. Should markets be the key to managing resources? What should regulation be of markets? What is the relationship between producers and consumers in the world today? What is the appropriate balance? All of these issues are very difficult, but nonetheless, what we suggest is that now is the time to begin that kind of discussion about some of these issues. Discussion that can be fed into the new international architecture that's emerging around the globalization, the new globalization. The G20 may be an important forum. There may be other forums that need to be developed, regional ones or international ones. And particularly the aspect of transparency in resource markets is obviously going to be a key here, and that's, I think, where we'd like to conclude. Thank you.